Okay, good morning. I didn't even remember I had taken part in something like that in my youth, but okay, good. I was asked to give you sort of an overview, set the scene a little bit, give you a framework and throw a lot of numbers at you, so I'll do that. So that might be a bit heavy in the morning with all these numbers, but I'll try to put some story around it. I've split it basically in three pieces, so I'll start with the very high view on all the support functions and what in general is happening in terms of development in the support functions in the world. We'll then dive into GBS, Global Business Services. That's what we call shared services and outsourcing sort of in a model together. And then I will spend about the second half of the presentation on customer to cash, which is how we typically call this process nowadays, to dive into a little bit of detail on that. You can stop me at any time if you want, but then it will be your fault when I run over, okay? This was me some years ago. I think I was a little bit lighter, so they were still able to do this. But I have been in the shared service arena basically for almost 20 years now. So I started when most people didn't know what it was. And I think I can probably retire on this topic, so it looks pretty good. Oh, that was too much. This is sensitive. I'm not going to explain you too many things about Hackett. The only thing I want to explain is this picture here in the middle, because I will be showing a lot of numbers and then they refer to something being world-class. And world-class, of course, also has a definition. And the way we do it is, as any good consultant, I can solve all your problems on one slide with 2 axes. So that's a prerequisite to get this job. On this one, there is efficiency and effectiveness. And when we measure companies' performance, for example, in our benchmarking or research, you could look at efficiency in terms of being cost, cycle times, technology leverage, all kinds of different things. Effectiveness is things such as quality, service levels. Some things are difficult to measure, like usefulness of a forecast. Some things are easy to measure, like error rates. You just need to define what an error rate is, and then it's fairly simple. The point of the picture is that above this line that says 1Q is the first quartile of performance. So that's the best 25% of companies on effectiveness. And right of this line is the best 25% of companies in efficiency. So if you're doing the right things and doing them right, then that ends up being what we call world-class performance. It's about 8 to 10% of the whole database. So in simple words, it's top 10%, but not just on one dimension, but on both dimensions. So for example, this box here, right lower corner, we would call cheap but useless. Because you know, if the invoice doesn't go out and the money doesn't come in, then who cares about the process cost? So there will be a minimum effectiveness level that is always required. It might differ by company though. And this one here is just to give you an idea on sort of support function development in general. Oh, this is really sensitive. Okay, sorry, my mistake. So G&A is general and administrative. We count finance, HR, IT, and procurement into that. And you can see how the cost of these functions develops over time. Now, it's not really a surprise that the cost goes down, right? But there's an interesting difference between the functions. So for example, if you look at HR, 10 years ago, it was 0.64, today 0.64. So in HR, we basically have no change in terms of cost position relative to revenue. The other three have reduced. And then the way to remember this, because tomorrow you will have forgotten all the numbers, but an easy way to remember is that IT is double of finance, finance is double of HR, and HR is double of procurement. Of course, it doesn't apply to anybody here, right? But in general, it's a good sort of stick in the ground. If you have a revenue number and you wonder how big the function would be or how many people they would have, that's a fairly good starting point. And these functions develop very differently. So if we look at finance, which is probably of most interest to you here, then in finance we have the median development. So most companies are somewhere around 1% cost of revenue. They've gotten a little bit stuck there. The blue line here is those world-class people that I mentioned, the best 10%. They are improving constantly, and the specific thing in finance has been for a long period of time that this gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So there's constantly a small group of companies that is running faster, and the pressure on everybody else to try to find out how to catch up is getting constantly bigger. In procurement, we have exactly the opposite situation. So the curves are actually closing. And the level of cost in procurement is fairly low. So most of the time when we do some sort of assessment with a client, we will not be recommending any cost reduction, because normally the cost levels are quite lean. But there is a huge opportunity on the spend side. So just to give you an idea what the relationship is, if you take an average spend reduction opportunity and an average procurement cost reduction opportunity, then the spend side is 27 times as big as the process cost side. So most of the recommendations are more about increasing category managers, because they will pay for themselves easily. In IT, we had a funny situation for many years, because it's Blue Line, the world-class people, were actually spending more on technology than everybody else. In IT in general, when you look at an IT budget, whether it's high or low, actually doesn't tell you too much. What is interesting is if you just go to the second level and split it into two buckets. You split the IT in how much am I spending in running my existing operations, how much am I spending on designing and developing something new. And if the piece that I'm spending on developing something new is very large, then what happens is exactly this. You spend more, but it's an investment that pays off after certain years. Cycle times are quite long in IT. So just a high budget as such might not be a bad thing if it's spent on the right things. In HR, we have an opposite picture. In HR, basically every metric always tends upwards. Now, it's not a law of nature, but it is what it is, and you can argue it. Of course, you could say that the employee base in most companies reduces, and therefore maybe the HR cost per employee therefore increases. But of course, I could adjust the HR cost also if my employee base reduces. In any case, in HR, we constantly have sort of like a wave line. So it tends upwards, we get a crisis, it's beaten down, tends upwards, we get a crisis, it's beaten down. It goes a little bit like that. So if you do something in terms of improvements in a company, it's never a really good idea to do this 20% on everything approach. That is typically a political approach when nothing else is doable, but it's typically content-wise not a good idea. Then this is something that we do in the beginning of every year. We find out what the plans are for the companies in terms of their staff and operating budget. And you can see that in most years, you have some sort of small adjustment. Either it's a % up or a % down. The numbers are typically not very big. However, when we are in an environment where at least beginning of the year we had significant growth, now the number might be a little bit lower, but we still have growth, then we have significantly higher gaps to fill. So if I have 1% less staff, but I have 7% growth or 6% growth, then that growth typically also translates into volumes. So I need to do significantly more with slightly less. So it's actually quite a significant productivity gap. We know from our benchmarking business that 7% on an annual basis is something that almost nobody can do. Well, you can do 7% productivity in 1 year, maybe a second year, but year on year, every year, it's basically impossible. So the challenge is quite significant that is coming when you're in a growth environment, even if you have just small adjustments in budgets and employee numbers. And then if we look into GBS, Global Business Services, so we define Global Business Services as being all transactional shared service centers, all centers of expertise or competence centers, however you call them, so for skill and knowledge-based work, and all outsourcing. So anything that has been consolidated into this service delivery model. And finance has always been the function that has been utilized most. 77% of companies started GBS or shared services in finance. But there's not too much difference anymore to many other functions. So HR is pretty close behind. And you can see basically all of these functions are being utilized today in GBS. The fastest growing one actually is procurement. But remember, procurement was only a quarter of the size of finance. So often when people look at it, they say, well, my FTE number is not so big. It's not going to make a big impact. But of course it does, because in purchase to pay, for example, the procurement piece drives the actual finance piece significantly. So I can't get through improvements if I don't have the end-to-end processing scope. And then something that is quite interesting in my view is that when you look at, this is a finance example, I took mostly finance examples because I thought that this is what you are mostly interested in. If you go from more sort of simple transactional processes down to more skill knowledge-based processes, and just look at the red line that cuts through, then basically everything left of the red line is what we would consolidate into a GBS. So in cash application, we would be at somewhere around 90% that typically is consolidated, and 10% is still local in business unit. So there's always a split. I can never put 100% into the shared service environment. I mean, I can define the scope as being 100% what I have, but if I look at an end-to-end process, there's always a trigger and an output that typically sit outside. The interesting thing about this actually is that this is the line we have approximately today. So in finance, for example, currently the biggest focus is really on looking at decision support or controlling activities in terms of whether they also can be put into shared service environment. Nobody's actually arguing anymore about accounting. But 5 years ago, we had approximately this cut. So 5 years ago, I would still have discussions, for example, around general ledger, whether that can be done or not. But there's no reason why this line should be the magic line. So most probably, since the model is dynamic, it will move, and in 5 years' time probably be somewhere here. So it moves constantly. So the scope increases constantly. And then what many companies like to do nowadays when they talk about their GBS, they like to put themselves in some sort of maturity model and see how am I doing against others? Where is everybody else? Am I doing the same things? And this is a very simple maturity model with three stages. We have 57% of companies currently in this stage one. And in stage one, it is mainly about cost reduction. Most people start with cost reduction. And over time, when some of this cost reduction issue has been resolved and levels are better, the balance sort of comes in and you focus more on cost and service or value or quality issues, if you want, at the same time. Now, the cost issue never goes away. It always stays. But it will be balanced against sort of efficiency versus effectiveness targets. There's about 1/3 of companies who currently are in this stage. There's a few other things that change. For example, it typically becomes more multifunctional. The sourcing mix changes a little bit. There's more technology utilized in this phase. When you get to stage 3, which is only sort of a happy 8% that have made it there, then it is still cost and service, but what now comes in is this model about business partnering, business value. It's quite interesting when I talk to some of our customers, and they will tell me that the GBS people, for example, have a problem with their stakeholders. They try to explain to the stakeholders that I'm providing you all this great value, we do all this great work. And the stakeholder says, I don't understand what you mean. You guys do billing, payments. What value are you providing? So it's a very difficult discussion. You actually would need to put some tangible metrics on it, but then value is difficult to put metrics on. But this is where you get to in this stage 3, typically. Last year I did 5 projects that dealt only with adding value metrics to an existing KPI model. They had all fantastic models, but they didn't know how to explain the value that they were actually thinking that they were providing. So this is how it typically moves, and moves the same way in a specific process. And there's one thing that I thought I'd highlight out of our recent GBS study, because it's a big misalignment. This is asking GBS about their objectives and how well they perform against their objectives. So the way to read the slide is, the gray bar says how important something is, and the green bar says how effective I'm executing against it. So the logic would be the green bar should be longer than the gray bar. This is sort of the Boston Consulting way of showing things, and sometimes we borrow their ideas if they're good. And if you ask GBS people, then you can see all the green bars are longer than the gray bars. So they're fulfilling all the targets. Everything's great. If you ask stakeholders the same question, so in this case it's a C-suite, then you see that if you start here, compliance is good. Now compliance is a prerequisite in shared services, right? If I don't do compliance, I can close it down. We forget about that because it's sort of self-explanatory, but it is a showstopper. Cost is done well. Most people are happy with what is done on the cost side, but then aligning with the company's strategic goals and the quality of the services are two areas where the stakeholders seem to have higher requirements. GBS doesn't seem to see it the same way. Now, whether they answered the question to us differently than to their GBS head, I don't know. But there seems to be a misalignment on these two areas. And that is something that also prohibits often to move up on the maturity curve. Because if you don't have the trust of the stakeholders that you can do more, especially on this and this, then they're not going to give any new scope. So there's the chicken or the hen and egg game is always the same. It always starts with GBS. GBS always has to pilot something and show the capability. You're never going to get a mandate that covers everything for the next 10 years. So then I thought I'll do something quick on talent management, because there seems to be this war for talent out there for 25 years now. And we do talent management surveys all the time. This came out of this summer. And there's quite radical changes in many skills in the market. What is interesting is if you look at some of the developments in terms of the current positioning and 2 to 3 years. So the idea is that this is demand and this is difficulty to attract and retain. So if I'm up here, then I really have a problem because I have strong demand, but I have extreme difficulty to attract and retain these skills. And the ones that are moving into that are, for example, managing others. That's a basic skill, but most companies have difficulty finding enough of that. There's data analysis and modeling, which as such is not a difficult thing, but there's not the number on the market that will be required in the future, because this will explode in demand. And there's a few other things, like, for example, strategic thinking and analysis, which already is a problem for most people. Now, it doesn't have to apply to the Brno market, but it applies in general. And of course, there are huge differences by labor market. And then if you look at the finance-specific skills, then probably most of you deal with this. So revenue cycle typically is not a big problem. So this is rather an easier task. There's typically in most labor markets enough skill in the market. But there's other areas, for example in finance, that become much more a problem in the next years. So then something on offshoring. Now I'm not going to do any slides on the Czech Republic because I assume that other people will do that in more detail. But just in general, it's quite interesting that if you go to a company, say headquarter in Western Europe, then the perception is that, you know, everything's gone. We used to have all this work here, and now it's all gone. But in reality, it's only about 20 or 30% that actually has been offshored. So we're still sort of at the beginning of this movement. In stage 3, that's the maturity level, the highest maturity level with the 8% of companies. So with those companies, we would have about half of the activity. So half of the FTEs also moved to an offshore location. And what is actually interesting is if you look at the offshoring topic and you think about, well, how long can we keep offshoring? Because there will be a limited number of jobs. I mean, when you have offshored every single job there is, then that's the end of it, isn't it? So how many are left? So we counted them for a specific starting position here with 8.3 million jobs based on North America and Western Europe, because those are typically the ones moving them. And then you have a layer here on the top, 1.5 million jobs, the white area, which has been eliminated because it's the productivity improvement. So they basically, the job moved into the machine. And the yellow piece is 2 million jobs that we have offshored so far. So it's not small. You know, if you just have a few percentage points of a 2 million market, that's quite a significant activity. We have 1.3 million jobs left based on the current model and splits. At current speed, that would take 8 years. So we still have 8 years of offshoring. Maybe something changes in the model, and then we might have more or less, but you know, everything being equal at the same speed, it takes 8 years to offshore these. So there's still a significant number of jobs coming. And then there's this piece here, which is, if you remember the slide with the red line in the middle, is the piece on the right of it. So the piece that we would normally not consolidate. So that might change. So then this number also goes down. But in general, the offshoring game is an ending game. And when the offshoring ends and we don't have wage arbitrage anymore to produce, then we need to go back to the productivity game. And then remember the productivity number I showed you at the beginning. Then you have 7% as a target. And you're going to say that's impossible. Well, but there's no wage arbitrage anymore. So what am I going to do? 7% per year. So then I either fail on the target or I need to do something more radical. How do I do more radical productivity improvement? I need to do significant automation. And what is a prerequisite for automation levels which are much higher than today? Standardization. Standardization is not fun. You know, I know it. I was running our European operations when we got in a ERP system and a shared service center, and I was screaming and yelling. And then I reminded myself of what I told the customers the previous day. I said, well, why don't you try your own medicine? I actually did work, but I know that it's not fun. And the standardization approach, if you look at it, and let's take customer to cash as an example, we're currently at about 35% standardization level from an end-to-end point of view. And companies are telling us that they plan to move from 35 to 63. Now, never mind how it's measured because it's quite complicated. But the point is, this is a huge increase. So there is a very, very ambitious plan out there in the market to standardize, especially on customer to cash. And then just one slide on sourcing. There is no right or wrong in this area. You know, if you look at the performance both with BPOs and captives, there's very similar performances on both sides. There's always good and bad examples on both sides. There's a few things where outsources are better, mainly speed, mainly better on speed. But the results are fairly equal. And interestingly, if you look at the sourcing mix, so how much is captive onshore, how much is captive offshore, and how much is outsourced, which typically is offshore, but doesn't have to be. Then you get this sort of pie, and it doesn't have to have 3 equal slices, but it just seems to be currently the preferred mix. And this is top performers, and this is the median of all companies. Interestingly, the pictures are almost the same. So everybody's using a sort of hybrid or selective outsourcing approach currently. So, and then let's get more into the details of customer to cash. That was a long intro to that, huh? So this is how we describe the process, just to start with what is it? Because everybody has a different name for it, right? I mean, somebody's doing receivables, somebody's doing invoice to cash, some people do order to cash, and some people do customer to cash. So the logic behind customer to cash is that it actually starts already in the sales area, then through credit and risk management, orders, contracts, billing, collections, dispute, cash. You can argue about the order of these things because depending on if somebody pays or not, obviously you have these things in different order, right? So don't get stuck on that. It's just a model to show you this is what we would include into this process from a sort of end-to-end point of view. And then in terms of some numbers. So if we look at the cost, this is again cost as percent of revenue. So it's similar to what you saw in the beginning in terms of 1% for finance. Now the difference is when we measure functional cost, it's fully loaded. So functional cost in finance, the 1% was labor and outsourcing, so the process cost, and technology and all other costs, training, travel, whatever. So fully loaded. When we look at this here, process cost, just so you don't get a shock now, right? This is only labor and outsourcing. No technology. We don't allocate technology and process costs because 20 years of experience told us any allocation is always wrong. The only thing you end up doing is arguing about the allocation. So you can do it, of course, for your own purpose. There's nothing wrong with it, but we don't do that because we think that the picture is better by looking at labor and outsourcing, so the direct process cost. And if you add those two together, you can have any sourcing mix you want. Whether you're doing it yourself or buying services, doesn't matter. You can always compare it. Now, if you look at these two pieces here, then you can see, first of all, huge gap. There's huge performance differences in the customer to cash area. And then if you look at this bar here, for a median company, the biggest piece is in billing, but collections is also fairly significant. Also, you can see that any one of these slices has some improvement potential. So in the process, it's not about doing only billing correctly. You know, you could outsource billing to somebody who does a fantastic job on it and is really low on cost, but that will not put you into a world-class position overall. And before you tell me that those numbers are of less use because there's huge differences by geography and industry, I agree. There's huge differences by geography and industry. So here's just an example. I just took an example of collections. And you can see here how different the numbers are for different regions. So world class, for example, is actually slightly higher than the European median number. So in Europe, typically our numbers are significantly better than the ones I showed. And if you go to Northern Europe, then they have no use for these numbers whatsoever because they have an environment in most countries in Northern Europe which is so highly automated that they typically split this by 10. So I know there's differences, but I still wanted to give you a sort of overview on these things, and obviously going into detail on every one is not possible for time reason, but here's just an idea. And again, on collections, if you now do it by industry, you'll see there's some industries where this is a very tricky process, and therefore the cost is significantly higher than in some others. So you can have tens or even hundreds of times or multiples in terms of the difference in cost. So it always makes sense to, you know, if you pull numbers from the internet, don't use them. Don't use our overall numbers for your own benchmarking. They're as guidance, but they can't be used for that purpose because the differences are so huge. One of the things, obviously, that is useful to improve performance is automation. The one area that's in quite good condition is automatically generated customer invoices. Here we have fantastic numbers. They almost look like old communist election results, 98%. Huh? Really good. All the other areas have some potential for improvement. And obviously world-class is always here, the same group that I showed you, the best 10% overall in performance, and then you can look at, well, what are they doing in a specific area or on a specific best practice? Not every best practice always works 100%, but most of these things align with the overall performance. Then if we look at credit, this is average time that it takes to complete new credit reviews. 1.4 for world-class, which is mainly based on the fact that it's more automated. Typically, they utilize some sort of external provider and just pull the data, and then it takes a day plus X to get it in. There's probably not a big impact on whether it takes 1 or 2 days. So this might be not the most critical metric, but if you think of the overall cycle time, there's a lot of these components that take 1, 2, 3 days, and if it adds up, you might have a problem at some point in time in terms of the overall cycle time. So I'll show you how that ends up overall. Sorry. This I know you can't read, but it will be in the materials, so maybe if you're interested, you can look at it later in detail. But the point is, just to remind me, to tell you that the idea in credit nowadays actually is to do segmentation and come to something called dynamic credit limits. So, you know, if you pull the data from an external credit agency or somebody who gives you a rating, then that number is typically 6 to 12 months old. So it doesn't typically tell you anything about what is currently happening. If you could use, for example, the payment history, the recent payment behaviors of a specific customer, that might be very useful. That could give you a much more updated piece of information, and you could actually adjust credit limits dynamically. They don't have to be done in a specific periodical way. And we know that on the other side, we have today a lot of movement on the supply chain financing. So people on the supply chain side are wanting to be more flexible. Some people have money, some people don't have money, and they want this model to be more flexible. Software providers today are providing tools where you can basically, through your software, automatically decide whether you're paying early or later and pay an interest or get a rebate. And there's financing included in that too. So these models already exist, but the prerequisite is that I know what I'm doing. I have to have some sort of dynamic view on this thing. And this would be certainly one of the sort of better ideas to look at in terms of best practice in customer to cash. Overall, companies end up with this sort of metric in billing. Customer invoices per FTE, 50,000. Now again, I know it depends. And process cost per customer invoice, $1 is sort of this magical number. Now that one again is probably not right for anybody. I know when Boeing sends out an invoice for an airplane that they have produced, it's a 5-digit number for the invoice generation. So, you know, if I go there and tell them it needs to be $1, I can leave immediately after that. So, not a good idea. But it still is overall $1. A few more metrics. So in terms of billing, the average time to bill is between 3 and 2 days. Does it matter if you have 30 days payment term? If I bill in 2 or 3 days? Probably not so much, as long as I don't run over in the overall process. Because typically what happens is, you know, you have 2 or 3 days here, and then you send it. And then problem is that the recipient needs 2 to 3 weeks to get this thing in their system for whatever reason. And then once they realize they need to pay, they're already at 32nd day. So it wasn't even, you know, bad intention. And then we're already in our days delinquent area. And so it might help to be shorter here. It's probably not relevant whether you're 2.9 or 2, but if you're at 5 and you can get it to 2, you might actually impact that. Then in terms of billing errors, this actually can provide quite a nice source of improvement. And if you look at the invoices related to disputes, then in world class, we have still value-based, 1.6% of invoices disputed. Disputed means it's not being paid, right? Because something's not in order. And that is our revenue, the value, right? So if you have 1 billion revenue and 1.6% of it is disputed, it's not being paid. By the way, if you compare, for example, to the whole cost of the finance function, which was 1.2% of revenue, then you know our disputed number is bigger than the whole finance cost. It's not a small number. So, collections, not too bad in terms of collected within terms. And here is something on receivables over 90 days. I think those are more sort of for information. What is more interesting is then, you know, what is actually my ADD, or we look at DSO less best possible DSO. So if you have 30 days payment terms and you have 33.8, then I have actually 3.8 relative to the payment terms that I can be improving, except for if I go into the payment terms. That's then a different topic. And this piece is the one that typically you should look at. When you look at DSOs, obviously all these working capital metrics, they're significantly different by industry and geography again. So there's no point actually comparing to somebody who does something completely different. But they are a very good source of improvement. Now, I used to be an accountant before I became a consultant. I didn't understand working capital, you know, so it took me a while to understand it. But I now understand that in working capital you can save more regardless of your interest rate discussion, but you can save more than you actually have as process cost. So very good area. What is surprising is that we always end up with 1% bad debt. It seems to be that there's sort of some basic number of companies who don't pay, don't want to pay, don't intend to pay, or can't pay, or go bankrupt, or whatever it is, but they just don't pay. So everything else I've done in this process, I've automated, I've changed the cycle times, you know, I segment, I optimize, I try to do it with less cost, and at the end I still end up with 1% that doesn't come in. So it's in some industries maybe different than in others, but in general there's always some number on the bottom that is very hard to change. Collection contacts, quite a big gap here. So world class can do 10,000 collection contacts per FTE, and the process cost per collection contact is a bit lower. Interestingly, it's not that much lower. It's not the same gap, so they must be also doing it a little bit differently. The main thing in collections I wanted to point out though is the segmentation idea. So what is really a good idea is to recognize that obviously all these reminders and collections are very different in different countries and industries, and sometimes even legally regulated how to do it. So it makes a lot of sense to think about who to remind and when, and what kind of language to use. You know, am I taking an approach which is friendly or unfriendly? Maybe not unfriendly, okay, but very friendly and friendly, okay? But you know, am I very firm on getting the payment, or is it something strategically relevant where I really don't want to piss off the customer? So the main thing here, whatever sort of solution or model you come up with, is to look at all of these different variations and come up with some sort of segmentation. And it could be that 90% runs through, so why would I remind the 90% that always pay on time? That wouldn't do any good. But what about the 10% that don't? And do I need to remind before? What do I do in the collections? How do I do it? Do I call? Do I send something? Is there a legal requirement to do it? How do I align with that? So the whole idea here is to run some sort of segmentation and come up with a good model. It's basically the main difference in this area in performance. Sorry. And the last point on content, if you want, here on this process is dispute management. So I'm not going to go through this thing here, but the main point in dispute management is, you know, when I get disputes and I'm in a shared service center, then often the people realize that, okay, we always get this type of dispute in this type of this business with this type of invoice or these goods or whatever. They learn quickly what it is, and then they're more efficient in dealing with it. Their metric goes up. Everybody's happy. But actually, the right idea would be to do dispute prevention and play this back to the sales area so that they prevent this thing from happening. Of course, then the shared service metric goes down. So I need to find a way to explain why we still need to close the loop. But that would be the main idea in this area. And then I'm not going to go through this either, but I just want to give you an idea what are, you know, we see a lot of metrics, and I know you people use metrics in your work. This is the sort of typical list of metrics for customer to cash. And this list has not changed much in the last years. The only thing that really has changed is this thing here. So some sort of customer satisfaction survey or feedback, that is increasingly in the KPI models, and it wasn't 5 to 10 years ago. And it's a good idea to do that. And then I think I've got two things here on working capital. Overall, working capital consists of days sales outstanding, days inventory outstanding, and days payables outstanding. DSO plus DIO minus DPO is days working capital. Okay? And what you can see here in the total days working capital is that since the last crisis in 2009, we have had significant improvement on the working capital position. So, you know, interest rates in the market are low. That has very little to do with this. Sometimes people tell me interest rates are low, so working capital doesn't matter. Forget it. It always matters. doesn't have anything to do with those interest rates. And sorry, this thing likes me only to a limited amount. And then when we compare these things, days sales outstanding, days inventory, payables, working capital, you can look at also median and the first quartile performance, and you can calculate, if you want, just sort of to have an idea what it means actually, how much the effect would be if we would save a day on these metrics. Because these numbers in terms of days are just days, right? So I translate them into, well, what is the actual saving in cash? And then obviously you need to put some sort of interest rate on it, WACC or whatever you use, doesn't matter. Actually, the average interest rate we've seen used in the working capital area is more around 8%, regardless of the fact that interest rates might be 2%. And this would be the last one that I end on, sort of to summarize. Obviously, it's always tough to summarize everything on one slide, but this is sort of a pyramid that shows you how these things, in a very simplified way, typically move. So people start here with complexity reduction, simplifying and standardizing. Then automation comes in. Then you need to start measuring things. Obviously, very important to measure. Then best practices come in increasingly. So for example, the scoring models, segmentation, things like that. Once you get through this sort of operating excellence phase, at the top end of it, you start actually producing value. Now others see it because the planning, budgeting, and treasury processes are benefiting from this. So in this area, you can easily discuss what value you're providing. In this area, it's quite difficult. And then the end-to-end process view comes in. You actually take up the challenge to talk to somebody outside your function. And then on the top of the pyramid, typically, it is not so much anymore about what the process costs. It is what it provides in other benefits, mainly working capital. So that would have been sort of my intro. I hope it is useful for you, sort of to frame the topic a little bit for the conference. I'll be around today if you have any questions and want to catch me in the break. Happy to do so. Thank you very much. I need to ask the chairman if I go off or questions, or if there are any questions, I'm allowed to take them. And if not, then yeah.
And our peers were saying, our peers were saying we weren't as effective as we should be. I believe that's related to the fact that a lot of decisions that are made in shared services, accounting is a delivery on a certain day, sets of numbers that balance, orders need to get in on time. In credit, we make decisions that sometimes we say no. We can't give you that credit limit, or we can't release that order. You think that's one of the reasons why that satisfaction rating isn't as high?
Yeah, it was not meant to be a critique on the GBS heads in the room, okay? But typically, as in most things, there's always two components. Part of it is perception, and part of it is actual performance. So you mean the difference between the stakeholder view and the GBS view on itself, right? So there will be a difference in the weighting and in the importance. I mean, having done a lot of shared service work in my life, I know that the cost is constantly the focus area, and people come back to a sheet of paper with a few key metrics, and I need to get this 4% saving here, and how much does the technology cost? No, we're not going to do that. We do something else and tweak it and somehow do it, and then a little bit of labor arbitrage comes in and saves it. That's typically what happens. But the C-level view really is because they're not in the details. Their view really is that this is a model that I ultimately want to help me in transforming the company, and it should be a model that ultimately takes care of all my support function activity, and we can concentrate on doing business. All the reflections of it are as efficient as possible. And so of course they are a little bit ahead in their thinking. So I don't think it's a critique in the way that it's damaging, but it is something that needs to be overcome in the discussion process when you want to move up. Because say you have a transactional finance shared service center and you want to explain that you can do also decision support. So they're not going to give budgeting just like that, just because billing was done well. And as I mentioned on the talent management side, it is also a different skill profile that is needed. And the logic is to start with something small, get the skills for that, show that you can get the skills and you have them, and then when there's success on that, then their perception also changes a little bit. So I'm not disagreeing with you, yeah, but it is a tricky area though. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.